Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. Oh, don't you compassionate left-wing Biden supporters just feel all warm and fuzzy inside, getting exactly what you voted for, huh? You voted to make the world a better place, to return decency, morals, and compassion into the White House. And what'd you get? A broken economy with an old goof who keeps claiming that Bidenomics is working, humanitarian crisis after humanitarian crisis, an absolute failure to deliver on most of the major promises, especially the progressive promises, and of course escalation of war, warmongering, fighting yet again another illegal war, a proxy war without Congress's approval, and now, well, you know, just casual war crimes. Nothing to see here, folks. And I'm not the one claiming that we're seeing a Biden war crime. No, that definition comes from the Biden White House itself, from a clip not so long ago that Joe Biden probably doesn't want you to see. We've got some stuff to talk about, some more Washington establishment, Pentagon, warmongering, foreign policy. Not surprising to anyone. Let's roll the tape. All right, folks, let's first start off with this clip right over here. This is the 2022 Biden administration response to reports that Russia had been using cluster bombs.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime. Obviously, there are a range of international fora that would assess that. So certainly we would look to that to be a part of that conversation.
Based on their definition, the use of cluster bombs constitutes a war crime. That was the stance back then. Now, all of a sudden, here's the report that we're getting. With a stroke of his pen, Joe Biden has rendered UN resolutions barring the use of cluster munitions null and void. Pandora's box has been opened, and the consequences of this decision will be felt for years to come.
What made you change your mind and decide to give them these weapons?
Two things, Fareed, and it was a very difficult decision on my part. And by the way, I discussed this with our allies, discussed this with our friends up on the Hill, and we're in a situation where Ukraine continues to be brutally attacked across the board by munitions, by these cluster munitions that have dud rates that are very, very low, very very that are a danger to civilians, number one. Number two, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The ammunition that they call them 155 millimeter weapons. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. But it was not an easy decision, and we're not signatories to that agreement. But it took me a while to be convinced to do it. But the main thing is they either have the weapons to stop the Russians now keep them from stopping the Ukrainian offensive through these areas, or they don't, and I think they needed them.
Now, all of a sudden, Joe Biden is justifying the approval of sending cluster bombs to the Ukrainians. Here's Jake Sullivan's justification over the decision.
Is that it is going to use these in a very careful way that is aimed at minimizing any risk to civilians. And by the way, Ukraine, the democratically elected government of Ukraine, has every incentive to minimize risk to civilians because it's their citizens. It's Ukrainians who they are trying to protect and defend. This is not Ukraine taking these and going and using them in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or in some faraway land. They're using them on their territory to defend their territory.
And of course, I know, the Leftoid Defense. Well, actually, the Russians planned on using cluster bombs to target civilians. The Ukrainians are using them within their own borders in Ukraine to defend against the onslaught. A bunch of copium. At the end of the day, it's very simple. It's yet again another provocation, yet again, of another instance of the federal government getting involved and throwing fuel on the fire, delving the world into further chaos. That's what's going on here. You have all of these leftoids, these supposed anti-establishment, anti-war, compassionate liberals, jumping through hoops, twisting and contorting their bodies in these pathetic efforts to justify prolonging, provoking, and inciting further conflict with Russia. That is exactly what's going on. It's the frickin' war machine, continuing to use taxpayer dollars in their efforts to enable this conflict further. And of course, using Ukrainian men as a freaking meat shield. It's despicable. But of course, Donald Trump was the bad guy, huh? Joe Rogan put it into perspective the other day.
Did you see that interview with him where he said I would end the Ukraine war in a day?
Right. And
he said, do you not want Ukraine to win? Do you want Russia to win? He goes, no, I want people to stop dying.
Yeah, I saw that. Dude.
It's perfect.
You're allowed to say that.
Let's find that. Because they're playing gotcha on a subject. They're doing gotcha interview real quick. You don't have much time with them, so you got to get a gotcha. And they're doing this with a subject that literally has the fate of the world in front of it.
Right.
Because if nuclear war breaks out, because of all this, and these people are just flippantly supporting this continued conflict with no talk at all about some sort of a compromise.
Yeah.
Some sort of a conversation.
Anything. Or just starting a conversation, starting one.
Wake up, people. Donald Trump wasn't the evil one. Donald Trump wasn't the one recklessly stoking the flames of war, leading us to possible Armageddon. No, that happens to be the sleepy, creepy guy. It's absolutely insane. And speaking of that, here's Joe Biden now promoting this idea.
I think we have to lay out a path, for the rational path, for for Ukraine to be able to qualify to get into NATO.
Ukraine joining NATO. Of course, all the blind leftoid sheep just clapping like a bunch of seals. Erf. Yas, Queen, Ukraine to NATO. What kind of foreign policy is this? There was supposed to be an agreement to stop NATO expansion. Even months ago, there was supposedly a peace treaty on the table, yet United States and British forces stopped the talks from moving forward at the time. We're seeing a refusal to compromise, a refusal to negotiate, to put an end to the bloodshed, and instead, further provocation, essentially now telling the Russians that it's American policy that Ukraine join NATO, putting NATO forces directly on Russia's largest land border. It's absurd. And of course, all the same establishment hacks, I'd argue freaking traitors like Lindsey Graham, are quick to push the idea. Lindsey Graham writes, I will be working with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to pass a resolution urging the admission of Ukraine to NATO. The best way to prevent future wars and promote peace is to create security guarantees that make aggressor nations think twice before starting wars. Ukrainian NATO membership is vital to the future security of Europe and the world. I believe there is an overwhelming majority of senators supporting this position. What a monumental clown. This holier-than-thou attitude, as if the Russian government is simply evil, an aggressor nation, and globalist entities like NATO and the United States had nothing to do with provoking this conflict in the first place. It's completely absurd. Rand Paul responds, absolutely not. This is exactly wrong, as usual, and could very well lead us to war with Russia, something that no one should want. Absolutely. We should be looking towards diplomacy, not engaging in threats and intimidation, putting cannons and tanks and armed forces on the Russian border in an attempt to force submission. In what universe is that the best way to deter conflict? That's exactly how we got here in the first place, in this war that the American public doesn't even want to be in. Well, too bad, you're in it whether you like it or not. Without Congress approval, without an actual declaration of war, you're pretty much in it because you're the one freaking paying for it with your tax dollars. And now you're paying for awful weapons to be used for the sake of democracy, which the country of Ukraine, from my understanding, isn't even a legitimate democracy. Here's Jonathan Capehart at PBS NewsHour vigorously defending President Joe Biden's decision to send cluster bombs.
With Zelensky pleading with the United States and the West, please send tanks, please send planes, please send us the most advanced military equipment you can give us because we need it. And so, sending cluster munitions is, I think probably crosses a line for a lot of people. But when you are the Western Alliance, and the big mantra is this is authoritarianism versus democracy, and democracy must win. Well, democracy has to have all the tools possible to make it possible.
Here's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, now backing Joe Biden for re-election. Glenn Greenwald put it best. AOC, who ran her 2018 primary campaign based on a vow to wage war against the Democrat Party DC establishment, announces her support for Joe Biden's re-election in the Democratic primary on the day that he announced cluster bombs for Ukraine. Cluster bombs that, by the way, in many cases failed to detonate, essentially leaving what you could probably describe as active landmines clustered throughout the landscape. But don't worry about that. Don't pay attention to that, as Jake Sullivan says. Ukraine's gonna have to be demined regardless. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. Oh well, don't worry about that. Democracy, landmines and destruction everywhere. Oh well, don't worry about that. It's just a consequence of democracy. This isn't democracy in action. This isn't the will of the American voter. This is the will, this is the agenda, the motive of the Pentagon military machine. This is what you leftoids voted for, you compassionate liberals. It's unbelievable. All the damage, all the destruction, the further escalation and provocation instead of coming to an actual agreement and ending this conflict once and for all diplomatically. Why? For what? Just so leftoids could virtue signal on Twitter and put a damn Ukrainian flag on their Twitter handle. It's totally disgraceful. This administration and the leftist establishment and uniparty establishment are completely frickin' out of control. That's what I got for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. You know that we'd love to have you here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.